Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and today I'm going to talk about politics. Much of what I've talked about before revolves around money. And in one very critical issue, money and politics share the same structure. And this is why I want to explain to you what that structure is and the part that you play in it. What I've talked about these last few years is money itself. And money, there's many levels of money. And the people who are watching this program, the vast majority of you, the vast majority of people on this planet, understand money from what I call the retail level. You use it. You want it. You have to do something to get it. You want it to buy it. And that's what you're understanding. You're at the retail level. Well, and at the retail level probably encompasses, I would say, 90% of humanity. Then there's a level of called distribution. And the distribution of money involves probably 8% of humanity. All right? But the real critical thing to understand money happens only if you understand the top level, what I call the manufacturing level. And this level probably is the 1 to 2%, and probably the 1%, and maybe even less. And if you understand money the way the top 1 to 2% understand money, you will understand money in a totally different way than the people who distribute money even understand it, and certainly the mass of people, the ones who deal with it at a retail level. The ones who manufacture money see money from a totally different point of view. They know money is manufactured because they're the ones manufacturing it. They know that money has value because of the system within which it's created. And they know money, there's a purpose to money as it stands today. And the purpose of money today is to ensure that the 1 to 2% who actually manufacture the money, and perhaps the 8% that are involved in its distribution, live off the 92% or the 90% that is dealing with money at a retail level. Now, I'm going to say and tell you that that same structure exists in terms of power. That in terms of power, only the 1 to 2% who are at the very top understand what the distribution of power is and how it's done. That there's another level of perhaps 8 to 10% beneath that 1 to 2% that distribute that power. And the mass of the people on this planet, the 90% generally, are the ones who deal with retail, the retail distribution of power. And just like money, the lower you are on that scale, the more of you there is, and the less that you have of it. Just as the 90% of you who deal with money at a retail level, there's more of you on the planet, and although there's more of you, the more of you have less of it. The 1 to 2% at the very top, though they are less in number, they have more money than all the rest of you combined in the aggregate. And so it is with power. The 1 to 2% at the top have far more of that power than the 90% in the aggregate have at the bottom. So money and power share that in common. And I've spent most of the last few years talking about money, how it's distributed, where the bankers are, and the effects of it are. But today I want to talk about power and why you don't really understand power any more than you understand money. I think I've made it clear, at least to those who have listened, that our understanding of money is so limited and it's so far away from the truth. That's perhaps the reason why we have so little of it and the ones at the top have so much of it. And today I'm going to talk about how that same structure involves power. And those at the retail level of power, those who vote, those who think it's this, those who think it's that, have so little of it. Now those involved in the distribution of power, they have 8 to 10% of it. Okay? They only have 8 to 10% of the people. 90% of the people are involved at the retail level, and you have very little power at all. There's a structure above you that's involved in the distribution of power. And I'm speaking here mainly of the United States, so it's the model you can hold over most of the rest of the world, even communist China, which doesn't have an election system they have here, but it's still generally the same. The 90% have very little power, and they're the mass of the people in that structure. You have 8 to 10% involved in the distribution of power, and they have much more than even the 90% do. But then you have the 1% at the top. Now, communist China is sort of like a model of the communist model. And what people don't realize in the United States, and mostly even in China, that 70% of the people in the National Congress of communists, 70 of them, not 70%, 70 of those people have now become billionaires in the last few years. Billionaires. There's 70 people who are going to attend the National Communist Party Congress in China probably this fall that are billionaires. Now, they didn't get there by how they do it in the United States. They got there by being in the right place at the right time, because they are the 1% in China. Just as the 1% in the United States are also billionaires, but they got there by another way. But it doesn't matter. It basically shakes out to the same 90% of the bottom with very little power, very little money, 8 to 10% involved in the distribution of money and power around the world that have more than the 90% have at the bottom. And then there's the 1% at the top, 1 to 2%, that have the vast majority of it. Now, those who listen to this program, or those who don't even listen to this program, those who are in retail level, have a very, very limited understanding of both money and power. And what I want to explain to you today is what it looks like from the top. And let me assure you, money and power look very different to those at the top than it does to those at the bottom. And it's not just a matter of amount. It's not just a matter that if you had more power, you would understand it better, or if you had more money, you would understand it better. That's not true. There is a huge difference in the understanding of money at the top and the understanding of power at the top. Those of you who have spent your entire lives at the bottom have spent your entire lives trying to get money and trying to get power. And I think I'm safe to say it's like climbing a mountain. You may have made it a little up the hill, but somehow certain things have happened and you find yourself slipping down. And there's a few people you have seen who have made it way up the hill. All right? But you know, in regards to power and regards to money, they are very few and far between. Oh, the names like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, things like that, Warren Buffett, all right? And that's what you see. Those of you, of us, who are at the bottom of this hill trying to get up and up and up the top. But we do know that there's a 1% at the top, both in terms of money and both in terms of power. And what I talked about in my last program, I talked about one man, Pete Peterson. Pete Peterson graduated, I think, from the University of Chicago, went into public relations in New York, and somehow makes the transition from public relations into the corporate world, where Peter G. Peterson becomes the chairman of Bell and Howell, all right? And then he makes the transition from the chairman of Bell and Howell to the chairman of Lehman Brothers, one of the top banks in New York, a Wall Street bank. And then he makes a further transition from the chairman of Lehman Brothers to the chairman of Blackstone, an investment fund. All right? And as he's the chairman of Blackstone, he's also the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. This man is not only at the pinnacle of power in the United States in terms of money, but in terms of power. All right? CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. And I know most of you have never even heard of that. That's an indication of how little you understand money. And I want to tell you, very truthfully, that your understanding of power is as dismal and as distorted as your understanding of money. And today I want to spend a little time talking about the structure of power just as much as I talked about the structure of money. Peter G. Peterson sat at the pinnacle of both money and power in the United States. 3 years ago, when BlackRock finally went public, and when a company goes public, that means they're letting in the rest of the retail trade in on the inside game that the boys at the top have made. So the game for them is mainly over. They're just taking their chips off the table and they're cashing out. This is essentially what Mark Zuckerberg, and the boys at Facebook did when they went public just a few months ago. All right? They went retail. They let the retail in, the 90% of the bottom, who came in with, spent all their little retail dollars and, that they had managed to save and managed to accrue and and this includes you boys in the financial game that went and bought shares. Those of you who are in the distribution of money, all right? They let you in on their game at the retail level. All right? At the retail level. When the boys at the top, when the manufacturers of both money and power let the rest of people you into the game, it's basically over. They're just cashing out. And they keep enough in the game so they can control the game. Mark Zuckerberg still controls a controlling interest in Facebook. He just let the rest of the retail folks in on the game because it pays him at that point to cash out. And so it is with the world of power. When they let you vote, and they do let you vote, it's because they control the game, but they're still letting you in on it. Now, I want to assure you, to the folks who have the 1% of money and wealth, money is far too important to let its result be determined by democracy or by the 90%. And so it is even more so with power. Those who have the 1 to 2% of power, the aggregate power on this planet, it is far too important to let the 90% determine what happens to their 1 to 2%. Because their 1 to 2% of both money and power is far more than you have in the aggregate of the 90% at the retail level. So I want to explain to you what it looks like to them. And I've spent the past few years talking about what it looks like to them, the 1 to 2%, and why the bankers have set it up in such a way. To the bankers who manufacture money, you are the 90% in retail they loan the money to so they can live off the interest without doing a damn thing. Without doing anything. They loan it to governments. They loan it to corporations. They loan it to you. And what they loan you is your money that they put in their institutions in the aggregate that they can leverage at 10 to 1. They take your dollar, your hard-earned dollar. Maybe you didn't earn it working hard at all. Maybe you sloughed off on the job. But whatever it is, they take your dollar and they put it in the aggregate into a bank, which they run and control, and then they're enabled as owners of that bank to take the money that you put in as a deposit, create 10 to 15 times as much and loan it back to you at far higher interest rates than they give you when you put it in their bank. And this is the way they indebt you. This is the way they indebt governments. This is the way they indebt corporations. And what have they done for it? Nothing. They put on a suit like this. They get these gold chains like this. And let me tell you, this is the banker's suit. And I doubt if very few of you have ever seen a suit of this quality. This is made of the finest English worsted in the world. This is custom tailored. This is what they call a banker's suit. And not only do I know about these suits, I know about what they represent, who wears them, and how they have come by them. And it's just the same in the world of power as it is in the world of money. In the world of power, how they view it is this. They've worked long and hard over eons to get that power and to concentrate it. The people at the top in the United States today, they got there over generations. All right? They like to tell you that it's because somehow they've worked harder or they're smarter. But I think at this stage in the game, it's clear that it didn't happen that way. I mean, every once in a while, there's an imposter from the outside. That's the way they see them, who manages to claw their way into their game. Richard Nixon was like that of an imposter. He fought his way in. His parents were Quakers. He was not a good-looking man. He was not fast with the words. But out of sheer ambition and destiny, he fought his way into the inner circle, whereupon they found him so distasteful, they kicked him out. All right? Now, Ronald Reagan got his way in because he looked good, because he could tell Americans what they wanted to hear. He was an actor just as much in Washington, D.C. as he was in Hollywood. And that's what Americans wanted to hear. He was the most popular president in the history of the United States. And you know why they let him be the president and wanted him to be? Because he lulled Americans into a somnambulism. He told them they were great, hardworking people, and they deserved a country that reflected their values. And while he did so, the people behind Ronald Reagan stole this country blind. You have no idea what happened to this country unless you look at the statistics and see that starting in the 1980s, the United States became the debtor nation that it is today. We always has debts, but we never had it to the level that we had after Ronald Reagan. But he was powerful. He did exactly what they wanted him to do. He sold this country a bill of goods. Now, after Ronald Reagan, on the left, on the Democrats, you got Bill Clinton. And he sold this country the same bill of goods that Ronald Reagan had. But he sold it to the liberals, all right? He sold it to the different side of the Republicans and the Democrats. This country got sold a bill of goods, the conservatives by Ronald Reagan, who looked so good, he was able to pull the wool over the eyes of Republicans who previously thought this country should have a balanced budget. And you guys sucked it up to such a degree that when this man left office, the United States owed $3.5 trillion. He got elected on a platform of a balanced budget, but you sucked it up so good that when he left and you were in debt, you were happy. And same way with Bill Clinton. When he left, the American worker was in shambles. He had let the wolf in the door in more ways than one. NAFTA, he allowed all of a sudden jobs to go first to South America and then in the second term to China. He allowed the bankers, who were the anathema of the working class in America, to take control, not only the Republicans of who they owned, but the Democrats as well. And when it was over, so was the history and future of the United States. It allowed Bush II to come in and clean up and do what the Democrats would have never allowed to have been done. You know, I look at this process and I tell you, it's a sad, sorry story. And I'm tired of hearing it. And I'm tired of hearing you bitch and complain about how somebody did it to you. But you know what? You are right. Somebody did do it to you, and they're still doing it today. All you nice Democrats, and I love you. I love your heart, I love your care, and I love your compassion. But what I don't love is your inability to lie to yourselves. Your inability to accept the responsibility of what Bill Clinton did in 1996 with the Media Consolidation Act when he let Rupert Murdoch into the United States and create Fox News. The Republicans didn't do that. The Democrats did. The Democrats let him in. Just like the Democrats allowed China into the WTO and allowed U.S. corporations to send all the jobs to China, and now you're unemployed. Now you don't have a job. And now the corporations are running out of money to pay the pensions that they owe. I understand how you feel. I understand that you're confused. I understand that the Republicans are mad about balanced budgets, but I understand that you've lied to yourself and think it's the Democrats that drove the budget into the ground. It was the Republicans. If you understand statistics, you'd understand the budget gaps grew far greater than every Republican administration than even during the damn Democrats. But you don't see it. You don't understand what they've done to you, just like the Democrats don't understand what was done to them through the Democratic Party. The two-party system was used by those in power to divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. This is how ancient Rome ruled the rest of the world. They would come into countries, they'd find out how the power was split, and then they'd set each side against the other. Divide and conquer. This is how they've done it today. This is how they did it 2,000 years ago. This is a formula that works and works and works. And now, in the United States, you have the Democrats just absolutely convinced it's those asshole gun-toting, racist Republicans with their gun-loving guns who are so selfish they won't give a damn thing away, and they already have too much. And then you have the Republicans who blame all those tree-hugging, compassionate, loving, spineless Democrats for their problems, for the world not being the way it is. And you know why each of you thinks that? Because the boys at the top, the 1%, have got you in your palm. Just like they used Ronald Reagan to take over and destroy the fiscal integrity and the strength that it did exist one time at the core of the polarity represented by the Republican Party. So too did Bill Clinton. They used Bill Clinton to destroy the core of what existed at the Democratic Party. And now in 2012, as we face another election, these two political polarities don't even know who they are. And let me assure you, if you don't know who you are, you certainly can't lead others. For those of you who are upset about politics, about the other party, let me assure you, the boys who own the other side also own yours. You don't know it, because that's how power is distributed by the 8 to 10%. That's how the 1% at the top of the chain manages to stay in control of a country where they're supposed to stay in power because of voting. Now, this country is owned by the let's say 2%. Let's be generous. Let's not use that pejorative term, the 1%. Let's say it's double. Let's say there's twice as many of them than the 1%. Let's say there's 2% of them. But how they own and how they run this country is by the playbook, divide and conquer. And they have done so beyond their wildest expectations. But let me tell you something. When those who own everything get in control, they are no more capable of determining what should be done than others. They have run this country into the ground. They have indebted it beyond the ability of the citizenry to repay. This is true in Europe as it is in the United States. And the 90% of you, the retail trade of the political class, your only hope is that 1% and that 2%. And the 8 to 10% that distribute that power for him have so overplayed their hand that they are on the verge of collapse. 200 years ago, 210 years ago, it was possible to have a violent revolution and overthrow your tyrannical masters. That's what the United States did in 1776. It took force to do that. Bloodshed. Let me assure you, the 1 to 2% who own power now have so much of it. I love you people, your damn little love affair of guns. Thinking that you're going to stand up to tyranny in the United States with an illegally held AK-47 or a shotgun. You're wrong. But change is coming. Change is coming in spite of you. Change is coming in spite of them. And a change is going to come that's going to transform the paradigm of power and money that we've had. This program, I'm going to talk about politics in its purest sense. Politics is really the study of change, the process of change. That was my major in college. I had a degree in political science, and I graduated in 1966. And I want to tell you something. I'm a very political person in the sense that I look at politics and I think about it and I watch it. And I've never voted in a presidential invitation in the United States. Ever. And this is for a reason. I grew up during the 60s. And I realized that neither political party represented the world that I wanted to see. I realized this back in the 60s. And it's just as true today that neither political party represents the world that I wanted to see. But I'm going to talk about politics because I've looked at it. And I've looked at it in a way far differently than most people have. Politics is a study of change. Now, there are those who want change, and there are those who don't want it. And with this structure, with this framework, I hope you'll begin to understand just what's going on in the United States today. And this also holds true for very many other countries. There are those who want change, and there are those who don't. Now, in the last program, I talked about the 1% to 2% at the top of the structure. This is in terms of both money and power. And there's very little difference between the two when you come down to it, money and power. The truth in these structures is how it's distributed. At the bottom of the structure is the great mass, the aggregate, the retail in both money and power. And this aggregate that composes probably 90% of the people in the aggregate have very little money and power. All right? Then you have between them and the 1% to 2% of the top, you have the distributors, those who distribute money and power. CEOs, all right, political national chairmen, governors, senators, those are distributors, even presidents. All right? And then you have at the top the select 1% to 2%, those who manufacture truly, those who create, those who direct money and power itself. Now, those of us at the bottom have a very, very limited understanding of both money and power, which is natural. When you don't have very much money or you don't have very much power, your understanding of it is based on your perspective, which is very limited, as it is true about the amount of money and power that you have. Even in the aggregate, perhaps the 90% has a lot of money, far more than any of the individuals have, or power even, especially in terms of power. But the 1% to 2%, they're the ones who have it at the top. And they see money and power very differently than you do. Now, when it comes to money and power, and when it comes to politics, I will tell you one thing. Those at the top don't want change. Get that? I mean, I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, an atheist, a Catholic, a Buddhist, or whatever. Can you get that from natural self-interest, those at the top don't want change? Why? Because they are already where everybody is trying to get. They are where the 8 to 10% who distribute money and power would love to be. And the 8 to 10% are a lot closer to that 1% to 2% than the 90% of the bottom. And that 90% of the bottom really wants to be at the top of money and power. But they're really a long way away. So, in political terms, that 1% to 2% of the top are what I call natural conservatives. They're natural conservatives because they are advantaged by the status quo. They are advantaged by a system that has given them so much where the rest have so little. Now, for you who are in the 90% at the bottom, at retail, I want to tell you, these folks live very differently than you do, than we do. Very differently. All right? And it is natural. It is as natural to them that they would want to stay that way, as it is natural for those in the 90% at the bottom would like their world to be different. Do you understand this? The 90% of the bottom want change. They want their world to be different. They want to have more money and more power. The 8 to 10% who distribute money and power, they want change too. They want to get into that 1 to 2%, really 1%, that holds it at the top. And the 1% of the top doesn't want change at all, because they know that the chances of change happening, they're going to lose their money and power. Somebody else may replace them. Somebody else may step up. Maybe one of those ambitious people in the 8 to 10% that are involved in the distribution of power is going to push their way up into their little ranks. All right? And they know it's like a scale. At a certain point, if everybody gets up there, they're going to have less of what they have. So the 1 to 2% is committed to the status quo. The 1 to 2% are the true conservatives of the status quo, because they don't want change, because right now it benefits them, and the prospect of change brings with it the threat that they are going to have less of what they want. How do they stay in power then in a democracy, when 90% of the people really want change, and the 8 to 10% that is involved in the distribution of money and power would like change too, but they sort of identify with the 1%. So that system, I would say, they're against change too. They only want to get up to the top level. But basically, their vested interest is on the side of the 1 to 2% that control money and power. So you've got 10% of the top that don't want change, and you've got 90% of the bottom that want change. And you've got power, the process of change based on, quote, a democracy, where everybody theoretically gets one vote. Now, I don't know if you've ever asked yourself the question, how then, in a democratic context, does the 10% of the top stay in power, when the status quo only advantages the top 10%? When the 90% is basically screwed by the top 10%. Or if you're not screwed, you're just sort of eking an existence. You know, you got a job and you can pay down that $250,000 mortgage over 30 years. That somebody loaned you pieces of paper that they made up and they called it money. And you feel guilty when you can't pay it. And those bankers look at you with that look. If you were responsible like me, you'd be wearing this fine English wool worsted suit and not that crap-ass thing that you try and look like your best. How do they do it? How does the 10% of the top, with a vested interest in the status quo, manage to stay in power when 90% of the people are disadvantaged by the status quo and would want change? Well, it's rather simple when you come down to it, though it's not obvious. If it was obvious, things wouldn't be the way they are today. But it is nonetheless rather simple. Those at the top, the 10% that are advantaged by the present status quo, have found a way to manipulate the 90% in such a way that they can stay in power. Now, how do they do that? Well, it all revolves around change. When we started this program, I said the most critical issue in terms of power and politics is change. And with this, the demarcation, with this, the plumb line, change, the 10% of the top don't want it, and the 90% of the bottom are disadvantaged by the 10% of the top. So they should want change. But what the 10% of the top have done with the 90% is to split it so down the middle. They've split the 90% into 45% wanting change and 45% not wanting change. Now, how have they done that? How have they got 45%, almost 50% of the retail trade who have no power and very little money to want things not to change. When they sit at the top and have all the game, all the power, and all the money. They've done it by convincing half of the 90% that change is scary. That they have something to fear by change itself. Now, they can't go down and tell the 90% that, that if the economy changes, you're going to get less. Because they're already screwed. All right? Even the people at the bottom know it's not in their favor. So the rich can't go down and convince and talk to the 90% like the way they talk to themselves. And let me assure you, when the 10% meet, they don't have to talk politics. They don't have to convince each other to vote one way or another. They know what side their bread is buttered on. They already know it. No taxes, no payment, no obligation, no change. That's how the 10% meet and talk. Now there's a few at the top that don't think like that, and they're basically disregarded by the 90%. By the 10% of the top, I mean. It's the 90% that they've split down the middle about change. It's the 90% that they've got totally disturbed about things and so scared and so afraid that almost 50% of that 90% mass retail at the bottom is going to vote with them against change. Against change. When they're screwed by the status quo, when they've lost their jobs, when their pensions are at risk, when their working lives may be totally gone, everything done, and their houses are foreclosed. They've still got 50% of these damn people voting against change. All they did was they scared them. And it's real easy to scare people about anything. Mexicans, women, change itself. And that's really what it's all about. They've scared the 90% so much that at least 50% of them are so scared they're going to vote for the status quo when it's against their best interest. Now, I want to tell you something. Life is scary. The change that people want may not necessarily lead to what you want. There's always uncertainty with the future. There's always uncertainty with what is not yet here, with what's new. But what the people at the top have done is convinced those, or at least 50% of them at the bottom, that the very prospect of change is scarier than the status quo. That's something. That's something. Now, how have they done that? Well, they really did it. In the United States, used to have this balance between the Republicans and the Democrats. After the Civil War, essentially the Republicans became the party of the rich, the bankers, Wall Street, blah, blah, blah. And the Democrats were the party of change. Okay? You had the farmers, very conservative farmers, very rural people. Rural people tend to be more conservative than city people anyway, because everybody looks the same, things change slower. There's a certain rhyme and a reason to life, which is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with not wanting change when you're in a rhythm. There's nothing wrong with distrusting change when you're in a rhythm. There is something wrong with resisting change when you're being manipulated by those who it is in their interest to manipulate you into voting with them. And in a very crude way, what happened is, in the United States, this paradigm of the Republican New York bankers and in the South and against the Democrats and the working man, it blew apart when the winds of change started floating through this country in the 1960s. That's what did it. In the 1960s, when change started happening on a massive level, when civil rights brought the blacks into the game for the first time, and I tell you, racial differences are huge on this planet. Differences are huge. All right? That was huge. But the biggest change that happened didn't even have to do with black people. It had to do with women. Of all the things on this planet, the male supremacy is more widespread than anything else. Even in black Africa, the men rule and have. Even in Asia, the men have ruled. And in Europe, women were put on a pedestal, but still men ruled. And around 200 years ago, this started changing for a number of reasons. This is the deepest paradigm on the planet. The imbalance between the yin and the yang, the imbalance between the East and the West, and the imbalance between men and women. And people are used to the imbalance. They've gotten used to it, so they think it is the way things are supposed to be. The Christian fundamentalist South is as opposed to women's rights as the fundamentalist Muslims that stone women for doing the things that men do. And this began to change around 200 years ago. And as that change moved through humanity, so did the resistance to that change. It is no wonder that in 2012, one of the issues in the United States has become, quote unquote, the war against women. It is coming to the forefront. And what the top 1% has done, it has fueled this fear of change by the 90% at the bottom. They've split it. And so now, after all these changes happened, after all the 60s went through, it broke the electorate in the United States at the bottom, and 50% of them switched over to the rich boys, to the boys at the top, who are advantaged by the present system. And if you Democrats, you liberals, are thinking that there's any virtue in what you have done, Bill Clinton let Goldman Sachs into the Democratic Party in 1992. This shift to the Republicans was so huge by playing the change card, by playing this world is so scary, you got to vote with us who own everything. This is how those people with two last names, like Carter Wilson, you know, those guys who go to Princeton and Yale with last names for first names, this is how they got the people in the South with two first names for their name, Billy Bob, to vote with them. They got Mary Sue and Billy Bob voting for Carter Wallace, for Smith Barney, or for whoever they are. This is what happened when the change started moving and started affecting people. This is why the Muslims in these people, they're like everybody. All of us are good people. All of us want a better world. But change is disturbing, and it disturbs our world. For those in the United States who are upset by all the changes that happened since the 1960s, can you put yourself in the Middle East when all of a sudden you lived in tribes and you have this extended family, you believe this, and you believe that, and you believe that, and all of a sudden these kids are sitting there listening to stuff that's going on in Europe and watching YouTube and coming back and saying they want this and they want that? Of course there's a reaction. And there's no difference to that reaction. The difference is the boys at the top have played that reaction to their advantage. The boys at the top who own the system have played the fear card so that those on the bottom now vote with them. I'm going to tell you something. I don't vote. And I talked to somebody. She's Mexican, hardworking, and she just came and talked to me about what happened in Mexico, and she was heartbroken. You know, the PRI, the old rich boys, grabbed the country again after the little bout with democracy that they thought they were going to improve Mexico. She was heartbroken, truly heartbroken. She's hardworking, she cares about her country, and she saw that the boys at the top just took it again, like they had the PRI. And you know what I told her? I said, I don't vote. I don't vote because I don't have any hope. I don't have any hope in the prison system. But what I told her was this: I have faith. I have a huge amount of faith. I have the faith that goodness and compassion and carrying out a better world is going to happen in spite of the political party system, in spite of us, in spite of our inability to understand reality. I have faith that life is going to will out. I have faith that a better world is coming in spite of the political system, in spite of the leaders, in spite of who you've chosen to follow, who made their mark by lying to you because you wanted to hear the lies they tell you. I know you're so desperate for truth, for a world that you want to be, that you willingly listen to people who run millions of dollars of focus group to know what you want to hear. And I know that those on the right tell them with conviction, because they believe it too. Just as those on the left tell them with conviction on what they want to hear too. But I want to tell you something. A house divided cannot stand. A house when the male and female polarity are at each other's throats, instead of looking forward to see what the children need, what the house needs, what the future needs. Until the Republicans and Democrats, screw the Republicans and Democrats, until men and women in this country start talking to each other in a way that they haven't done so for 50 years, this country is not going to survive. But the collapse of this country may lead to the rebirth of America. And I really mean that. Those who own this country, the 1%, they're firmly in power. Not only do they own the money, not only do you own the distribution of money, not only do they own the power, and not only they own the distribution of power, which means both political parties. What they don't own is the process of life itself. Life is far bigger than even the richest man controls. Life is far bigger than the limited perspective of each political party fighting for gain at the expense of each other and the whole, and even themselves. What is happening in Washington, D.C. is a reflection of what is happening in the soul of humanity itself. Humanity is not yet done with the inner conflict over the male-female, over the internal dialogue between reason and emotion, between feeling, the heart, and the thoughts of the mind. Humanity is in a fragmented state. But that fragmented state is a state that we have become. It is not who we are. And I want to assure you in the depths of the political chaos that we are seeing in the United States during this election and in the world, that we are in change that is bigger than either the Republicans can contain or the Democrats can steer. And in that lies our salvation. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. I wasn't wrong about money, and I'm not wrong about power. And I'm not wrong about the wonderful future that is going to come almost in spite of our present state. It's going to get better. Trust me. But it's not going to be easy.